The 14th of August 1944. Over the heart of Germany, at 23,000 feet, the sky trembled with the roar of engines. The Messerschmitt's cockpit shook violently as the airspeed indicator crept beyond 500 kilometers per hour, the stick quivering in the pilot's hands. For 3 long years, this had been the moment of safety, the instant when German fighters could dive into the depths and leave their pursuers gasping behind. It was the tried and true escape, the ritual that meant survival. But on that day, something was terribly wrong. The American P-38 Lightning was still there, steady, relentless, its guns flashing as it clung to the dive with deadly control. What should have been a sanctuary had turned into a trap. The Luftwaffe pilots, hardened by countless battles, suddenly felt the chill of disbelief. Their tactic, their lifeline, no longer guaranteed freedom. The hunters who once mocked their opponents now found themselves hunted. This was no ordinary chase, it was the end of an illusion. The reason lay in a small innovation, almost invisible at a glance, yet revolutionary in effect: dive recovery flaps. Simple aluminum plates powered by electric motors, they gave the P-38 back its authority in the most dangerous of dives. With them, the Lightning could follow any German fighter into the abyss and emerge unbroken. It was a turning point few expected, a subtle shift that would rewrite the mathematics of survival in the skies. How could something so modest overturn a tactic that had shielded the Luftwaffe for 3 years? That question would define the battles to come, and the answer would forever change the story of air combat in World War II. The thunder of engines still lingers in the imagination, the echo of that August day in 1944 when the Messerschmitt dove and the P-38 refused to break away. Yet to understand how shocking that moment truly was, we must turn back the pages of the war and trace the flaw that had haunted American pilots for years. For hidden beneath the metal skin of the Lightning lay a weakness so dangerous, so unforgiving, that it nearly condemned the aircraft to mediocrity. It was a flaw of physics, not courage, and it was merciless in the way it punished those who dared push the plane beyond its limits. The P-38 was a marvel of design, in many respects sleek and powerful, with its twin booms and concentrated firepower. But when its pilots forced the Lightning into a steep dive, an invisible enemy stirred in the air itself. As the nose pitched downward and the speed increased, shock waves crept across the wing, unseen yet devastating. The controls stiffened, the tail shook, and then came the dreaded plunge. The aircraft nosed over into an almost vertical dive, beyond the reach of the pilot's strength. Compressibility, they called it, though to the men in the cockpit it felt like betrayal. No matter how desperately they pulled, the stick refused to answer, and often the dive ended in a fireball on the ground far below. The Germans quickly learned of this deadly trait. Reports filtered back through combat, through captured pilots, through observation. They discovered that the Lightning, for all its menace, could not follow them beyond a certain threshold. The Luftwaffe crafted a tactic as elegant as it was cruel. When pressed too hard, when the P-38 threatened to close the distance roll, inverted dive, steep and fast, and let physics do the rest. At first it was merely a trick, a clever maneuver that bought a few moments of freedom. But as the months turned into years, it hardened into doctrine. The split S and dive became the gospel of escape, preached in every briefing room, practiced in every squadron. And it worked. Time after time, in the skies over North Africa, the Mediterranean, and later over Europe itself, German fighters twisted away from battle and hurtled toward the earth. American pilots, aching with frustration, were forced to break off. They knew what awaited if they followed the sudden stiffening of the controls, the terrifying silence of command, lost the scream of wind that no man could master. The Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs reappeared moments later, climbing back with smug defiance, while the Lightning pilots were left circling, robbed of their prey. The effect on morale was corrosive. Imagine climbing into your cockpit day after day, knowing in your bones that your enemy holds a key you do not possess. You can match him in firepower, in skill, even in courage. But when he chooses the dive, you are powerless. It is not just defeat, it is humiliation. Reports from combat units carried the same weary refrain: they always get away. Among the men who flew, the Lightning hesitation began to creep in like rust on steel. They questioned attacks they might once have pressed. They held back, calculating whether the fight was worth the inevitable escape that awaited. For the Luftwaffe, this weakness was a gift, and they wielded it with confidence. Pilots who had once feared the lightning began to sneer at it, knowing they could choose the terms of engagement. If it chases you, instructors told the young recruits, just dive. The American will not follow. It became their shield, their guarantee, their ticket home. Even when their resources dwindled and the war turned against them, this one maneuver preserved a sense of superiority. It allowed them to mock their adversaries, to claim mastery in the one arena where physics seemed to side with Germany. There was something haunting in that contrast. The same sky that offered safety to one side became a prison to the other. For the Germans, the dive was sanctuary. For the Americans, it was a graveyard. The lightning's flaw carved a rift not just in tactics, but in spirit. And war, as history has taught us, is fought as much in the mind as in the air. A pilot who doubts his machine carries a heavier burden than the weight of his ammunition. He carries hesitation, and hesitation kills. So by the summer of 1943, the story seemed fixed. The Luftwaffe, battered but still cunning, relied on its escape dive to balance the odds. The Americans, despite their numbers and their industrial might, faced the bitter truth that their prized twin-engine fighter had a mortal flaw. The imbalance colored every dogfight, every encounter, every decision at altitude. It was the unspoken shadow in every pilot's mind. Chase too far, and you might not come back. Yet history has a way of turning shadows into light. The very flaw that emboldened the Germans and demoralized the Americans would one day become the spark for one of the most unexpected transformations in aerial warfare. But in those early years before the secret of the dive recovery flaps, the Lightning remained a bird with clipped wings, its pilots bound by the cruel laws of compressibility. They fought bravely, they bled, and they endured the shame of seeing their enemies slip away into the abyss, mocking them from below. That is why the events of August 1944 struck with such force. To grasp the shock of the Messerschmitt pilot who looked over his shoulder and saw the P-38 still there, steady and merciless, one must first understand the years of futility that preceded it. For 3 years, the dive was Germany's guarantee. For 3 years, American pilots tasted the bitterness of watching victory stolen in the span of a few seconds. It was a story of weakness, of arrogance, and of the silent war between confidence and doubt. And it is here, at the edge of despair, that the seeds of change began to grow. For in war, as in life, the deadliest weakness can sometimes be the birthplace of the most decisive strength. The years of frustration in the skies had begun to weigh heavily, not only on the men who flew the P-38, but also on those who designed it. Reports streamed back from the Mediterranean, from the fields of England, from the frigid skies above Germany. The Lightning could not follow. Time after time, the verdict was the same. Brave pilots pushed their machines beyond reason, only to find the stick locked in iron, the nose dropping into a death spiral from which no hand could pull them free. Lives were lost, missions compromised, morale strained to the breaking point. For the United States, which had placed so much faith in its twin-boomed fighter, the situation became intolerable. Something had to change. In the workshops and wind tunnels of Lockheed, the pressure was suffocating. Kelly Johnson, the brilliant and unrelenting chief designer, carried the burden like a man walking with stones in his pockets. He had foreseen the possibility of compressibility issues even in the earliest days of the Lightning's design, but the resources to test his fears had been withheld. Requests to the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics to conduct high-speed wind tunnel experiments were met with silence, or worse, with dismissal. Too dangerous, they said. The tunnels cannot withstand such trials. And so the men who needed answers most were left with shadows instead of data, forced to wrestle with a phantom that destroyed aircraft and men without warning. Each failure in the field echoed in the design offices like a hammer strike. Engineers pored over blueprints until their eyes burned. Test pilots risked their lives diving prototypes, hoping for control where none existed, sometimes barely returning, sometimes not at all. The atmosphere was tense. A blend of genius and desperation. This was no comfortable laboratory removed from the war. This was war itself, fought not with guns, but with calculations, with intuition, with courage, measured in equations and sweat. And everywhere lingered the same unspoken question. Could the Lightning ever be trusted at its limits? Doubt crept into every corner. Pilots muttered in the ready rooms, calling the P-38 a widowmaker. Mechanics shook their heads, knowing the flaw was beyond their tools. Even some within the Air Force wondered if the aircraft should be abandoned, written off as a bold experiment that had failed under the brutal realities of combat. To persist in such an environment demanded not just technical skill but stubborn faith. Faith that a solution existed hidden in the complexity of airflow and metal waiting to be uncovered. The search was relentless. Models were carved and tested, small-scale experiments run in improvised setups, every scrap of knowledge seized and examined. And then, slowly, a concept began to take shape. What if, instead of fighting the dive head-on, the engineers could nudge the airflow itself, shift the balance of forces at precisely the moment the Lightning lost its will to obey? What if a simple addition, a flap, small and swift, could restore control where none had existed before? It sounded almost absurd. Could something so modest, a sliver of metal on the underside of the wing, truly change the fate of a fighter and the pilots who flew it? The skeptics scoffed. The generals doubted. The very idea seemed too fragile for the brutal reality of war. But Kelly Johnson and his team pressed forward. They sketched, they argued, they refined. And in the back of their minds beat the same haunting thought: if they failed, men would die, and the Lightning would fade into history as a noble but doomed machine. Trials were arranged. Lockheed test pilots, men like Tony LeVier and Milo Burcham, climbed into their cockpits with the knowledge that they might not return. They strapped in, taxied down the runway, and climbed into the blue. At altitude, they nosed over throttles wide, the earth rushing up in a blur of green and brown. Would the new device hold? Would the aircraft obey? Or would another name be etched into the growing list of sacrifices? Sometimes the tests ended in shuddering failure. The flaps insufficient, the controls still locked. But then in time, the Lightning began to answer. A touch of authority returned to the stick. The nose responded. The dive could be checked. It was not yet perfect, but it was hope. And in war, hope is as precious as armor. Within Lockheed, the atmosphere shifted. Where there had been only despair, a flicker of belief now glowed. Perhaps this truly was the answer, not a miracle, but a simple, elegant correction to a deadly imbalance. The doubts remained, and many outside the circle of engineers still sneered. Yet the idea had proven itself in principle. The seed of salvation had been planted. Looking back, it is almost poetic. A vast industrial nation, locked in a global struggle, undone by invisible waves of air, and saved not by some monstrous invention, but by a sliver of metal, a flap that could be deployed in seconds. The genius of war is often cruel, but sometimes it is surprisingly humble. Still, the question lingered heavy as ever. Could such a small detail truly reverse years of failure? Could it erase the confidence of the Luftwaffe, who had built their survival on the certainty of the dive? Could it restore the pride of American pilots who longed for the moment when they could follow their enemies into the abyss and rise again in triumph? The answer would come only with blood and fire, with trials not in the laboratory, but in the unforgiving crucible of combat. But in the tense workshops of 1943 and 1944, with blueprints scattered and nerves frayed, the first step had been taken. The engineers had dared to believe that the tide could be turned, that the laws of physics could be bent, if only by a few degrees of metal and the courage to test them. And so, the stage was set. The Lightning, once crippled by a flaw that mocked its strength, now carried within its wings the possibility of redemption. The question was no longer whether the weakness existed. It was whether this tiny solution could stand against the storms of war. Could something so small truly change everything? The idea had begun as a whisper, almost too simple to believe. While some called for radical redesigns, for sweeping changes that would take years, a few stubborn minds clung to the thought that the solution might not be grand at all. It might in fact be something deceptively small. That was the paradox of war. Immense struggles sometimes turned on the narrowest hinges. In the case of the P-38, Lightning's salvation emerged not in a revolution of design, but in the addition of what seemed little more than two pieces of aluminum and an electric motor. They called them dive recovery flaps, and their purpose was not to give the Lightning new wings, but to give back to its pilots the confidence they had lost in the dive. The principle was disarmingly elegant. Compressibility shifted the center of pressure aft, dragging the nose down and stealing control from the pilot. The flaps deployed swiftly from beneath the wings pushed that balance forward again. In the span of seconds, what had been a death trap transformed into a controlled descent. Suddenly the stick responded, the aircraft bent to the will of its pilot, and the P-38 reclaimed the authority it had been denied. It was not brute force, but a surgeon's touch. A subtle correction that restored the relationship between man and machine. Kelly Johnson and his team knew they had uncovered something powerful, though they cloaked their excitement in the careful language of engineers. To them, this was no miracle. It was physics-tested and proven in wind and steel. Yet in the eyes of the pilots, it bordered on the miraculous. Men who had watched their comrades vanish into fire could now pull safely from dives that once spelled certain death. They described the sensation with awe. The shuddering ceased. The controls softened. The aircraft lived again in their hands. Still, skepticism hung thick. Could a device so modest truly shift the balance of aerial combat? Generals doubted, politicians dismissed, even fellow engineers muttered that such a fix was a patch, not a cure. But in the crucible of war, perfection was not the goal. Survival was. And survival often came from the unexpected, the overlooked, the humble. Test pilots became the torchbearers of belief. Tony LeVier strapped himself into the modified Lightning with the knowledge that he might never climb from the cockpit again. His dives were steep, merciless, designed to push the machine beyond its breaking point. And when the Earth rushed up to meet him and the familiar shudder began, he reached for the switch. In less than 2 seconds, the flaps deployed, the nose lifted, and the dive bent into recovery. What had once been a plunge into oblivion became a maneuver of precision. LeVier pulled, leveled, rolled, and even danced the Lightning across the field to prove the point the monster had been tamed. Word spread through the ranks like fire in dry grass. Pilots gathered on runways and leaned from control towers to watch the impossible become routine. They saw LeVier dive and live dive again and climb, defying the grim logic that had haunted them. The disbelief melted into cautious hope, and hope gave way to fierce anticipation. If the Lightning could follow into the dive, then the Luftwaffe's last refuge was crumbling. The balance of power in the skies might yet be reversed. But the story was not just one of triumph. It was also a reminder of fragility. Early shipments of the modification kits were destroyed in tragic accidents, delays that cost months, and forced men to keep fighting with flawed machines. For every Lightning that soared with new strength, another still carried the curse of compressibility. Pilots had to wait, had to endure, had to trust that the small promise glimpsed in test flights would one day reach them all. The war did not pause for engineering, and the Luftwaffe did not grant reprieve. And yet beneath the frustration, the quiet revolution was advancing. More and more aircraft rolled from factories equipped with the flaps. Mechanics learned to install them in the field, sometimes under open skies, sometimes under fire. Each modification was an act of defiance, a statement that the Americans would not surrender to physics or to fate. Piece by piece, the tide turned. There is a poetry in the way history records such changes. The dive recovery flaps were not glamorous. They did not roar like engines or gleam like guns. They were small, unassuming, their presence almost invisible to the untrained eye. But in those slivers of metal lived the difference between escape and destruction, between despair and resolve. They symbolized the essence of American wartime ingenuity, not the pursuit of wonder weapons, but the mastery of practical solutions, the will to find strength in subtlety. For the Germans, the shock would come suddenly and mercilessly. Pilots who had trusted for years in the dive would look back in horror to find the Lightning still behind them, unwavering, unstoppable. In those moments, the sanctuary of gravity collapsed, and with it the illusion of invincibility. What had been doctrine dissolved into panic. The hunted had become the hunters. Looking back, one can see the symmetry. The flaw that once defined the P-38's weakness became the crucible from which its strength was forged. The same dives that killed American pilots became the stage for their redemption. And the tiny flaps, almost laughable in their simplicity, carried within them the weight of victory. It was a lesson written not in theories, but in blood and smoke, that in war the smallest hinge can swing the largest door, and that courage is sometimes expressed not in sweeping gestures, but in the patience to believe in a detail. The Lightning had been given back its voice in the dive, and with it its pilots were given back their confidence. The sky, once tilted in favor of the enemy, began to level, and so the stage was set for the next act. The Germans would soon discover the truth, though by then it would be too late. The sanctuary they had trusted was gone, and the war in the air would never be the same again. The skies of Europe in 1944 carried with them a strange mixture of certainty and doubt. For years, the Luftwaffe had relied on their dive to escape the jaws of defeat, a maneuver drilled into every pilot until it became muscle memory. For years, American flyers had felt the sting of futility, watching victory slip away with each plunge toward the earth. Now, with the quiet arrival of dive recovery flaps on the P-38 Lightning, everything was about to change. Yet at that moment, standing on the threshold between the old reality and the new, the future was clouded with questions. The test flights had shown promise. The engineers believed. The pilots who had witnessed Tony LeVier's daring demonstrations felt hope ignite where despair had reigned. But combat is not won in laboratories or on airfields before a crowd of wide-eyed onlookers. Combat is chaos, merciless, and unforgiving. A theory proven at altitude on a clear day meant little when thunderheads rolled across the sky, when tracers stitched the air, when death lurked behind every cloud. Could these small, unassuming flaps truly bear the weight of battle? Could they erase years of German confidence and rewrite the unspoken contract of survival in the dive? The Luftwaffe did not know yet. They still carried themselves with the assurance of men who held a secret weapon, one that had never failed them. To roll inverted, to pull into a steep descent, to feel the stomach rise and the horizon spin. These had been gestures of freedom of life, stolen back from the jaws of defeat. Somewhere in the hearts of German pilots lived the certainty that no American would dare follow. That certainty was about to be shattered, but they could not imagine it. The dive was not merely a tactic. It was tradition, comfort, identity. To lose it would mean to lose a piece of themselves. And so the question lingered in the minds of all who knew what was coming. How much could a detail truly matter? How could a pair of aluminum plates, actuated by an electric motor in seconds, overturn 3 years of doctrine? The Luftwaffe had built its escape around physics, and physics they believed was immutable. The Lightning could not follow. The Lightning would not follow. Yet physics had been nudged, bent, twisted into compliance by ingenuity. The question was no longer whether the flaps worked. It was whether the world would believe what it was about to see. There is a tension in moments like these when the old order trembles, but has not yet fallen. Pilots walked to their aircraft with doubt and determination intermingling in their chests. Some still distrusted the modification, believing it too fragile to rely upon. Others longed to prove it in battle, to be the first to chase the enemy into the abyss and rise victorious. In briefing rooms, whispers circled. Had anyone yet seen a German fail to escape? Had anyone dared to follow? Stories spread like fire, half fact, half myth, each retelling, sharpening, anticipation. For the engineers, the stakes were just as high. They had labored through sleepless nights, endured the sneers of skeptics, and watched the war claim men while their solution waited on the sidelines. If the flaps faltered in combat, their names would be cursed as dreamers who gambled lives on illusions. If they succeeded, history would mark them as men who shifted the balance of air power with the stroke of a pencil and the strength of belief. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on every side. American commanders planned missions knowing that some of their Lightning still lacked the modification, that some men would still face the old terror of compressibility. German leaders sent their pilots into combat, unaware that their cherished dive was about to betray them. And high above, in the cold, thin air, where men gambled seconds for survival, fate waited to be revealed. Imagine the silence in those cockpits before the first true test. The lightning closes on its prey, the Messerschmitt rolls and dives as always. In the past, the American would have leveled off cursed and turned back. But now, hand on the switch, eyes locked on the enemy's tail, the pilot follows. The airframe shudders, the world becomes a blur, and then the flaps deploy. Control returns. The dive is no longer doom, but pursuit. In that instant, 3 years of certainty dissolve. The impossible has become real. It is easy to see the outcome in hindsight, to speak of inevitability. But in that fragile moment before combat proved the truth, nothing was certain. The men who carried the lightning into battle did so with hearts pounding, unsure whether the promise of the engineers would hold when the air grew thin and the ground rushed up. They carried hope but also fear, for they knew that history is rarely kind to those who trust too much in untested promises. Yet history also rewards courage, and courage was abundant in those days. Courage of the engineers who dared to dream small. Courage of the test pilots who risked their lives to prove an idea. Courage of the combat pilots who for the first time in years pressed their throttles forward and refused to let the enemy slip away. The stage was set for revelation. The Luftwaffe still believed in their sanctuary. The Americans now carried a secret of their own. The coming battles would decide not only who ruled the skies, but also whether a sliver of aluminum could truly change the rhythm of war. Could something so small topple years of doctrine? Could it strip away the arrogance of one side and restore the pride of the other? The answer waited in the clouds, in the thunder of engines, in the dives yet to come. And so the story moved from rumor to reality, from test to trial, from hope to proof. The next time a German fighter dove to escape the world would learn the truth. The question was not whether change was coming. The question was only this: who would live to see it? The air above Europe, in the summer of 1944, seemed deceptively calm, streaked with contrails that stretched like white scars across a pale blue sky. Beneath that calm lay tension, a battlefield where each second was a gamble between survival and oblivion. For years, the pattern had been fixed. When German pilots felt the pressure tighten behind them, they rolled, dove, and vanished into the depths of the atmosphere, untouchable by their pursuers. It was ritual, almost a certainty of war. But now, as American pilots sat in the cockpits of their newly modified P-38 Lightnings, a question pulsed through their veins. What would happen when they followed? Could they dare to break the unwritten law of the sky? It was the edge of transformation, the moment before revelation. The dive recovery flaps had been tested, proven, demonstrated, but never in the full fury of combat. Laboratory equations and daring trials meant little when the enemy was firing back, when adrenaline burned hotter than reason, when one mistake meant only fire and earth. Still, the Lightning pilots could feel it, the promise of change hanging in the air like the pause before thunder. They knew the enemy trusted the dive as if it were divine protection. They knew the enemy believed no American plane could follow. And they knew that belief was about to be destroyed. The weight of anticipation was almost unbearable. In ready rooms across England, men whispered about the new capability, half in hope, half in disbelief. Could such a tiny device truly hold up in the chaos of a dogfight? Could it erase 3 years of failure? Some clenched their fists and swore they would be the first to prove it in battle. Others sat in silence, haunted by memories of comrades lost to compressibility, unable to shake the fear that the modification was only a fragile illusion. Yet all of them strapped in, tightened their harnesses, and prepared to fly into the unknown. For the Germans, ignorance was a cruel ally. They rose into the skies with the same confidence as before, certain that if the fight turned sour, they could dive and live to fight again. To them, gravity was a friend, the dive, a loyal companion. They could not imagine that this companion had already betrayed them, that American ingenuity had stolen their sanctuary. In their minds, the balance of power was unchanged, their doctrine intact. That was the tragedy of war. Sometimes the battlefield shifts before you realize the ground beneath you has vanished. And so when the first encounters came, the world seemed to hold its breath. Lightning and Messerschmitt circled, danced, and collided in furious bursts of fire. Then, as always, the German rolled and dove, sure of his escape. But this time the American followed. Down they plunged, the wind screaming, the controls stiffening, the earth rushing closer. In past years, the Lightning would have frozen, helpless its pilot forced to pull away or perish. Now, with a flick of a switch, the dive recovery flaps deployed. The nose lifted, the stick answered, and the chase continued. In that instant, the impossible became reality. The German glanced back, expecting freedom, and found only the unyielding silhouette of the P-38 closing fast. The effect was more than tactical. It was psychological, a rupture in the very fabric of belief. For 3 years, the Luftwaffe had trusted in the dive. It was their safety, their certainty, their unbreakable law of escape. To see it stripped away was like watching the ground open beneath their feet. The sanctuary had become a trap, and with it, their confidence began to unravel. American pilots, once hesitant, now pressed attacks with renewed fury, their courage restored. No longer would they break off at the edge of compressibility. No longer would they watch the enemy vanish into the clouds below. The dive, once a German victory, had become an American weapon. In those first moments of revelation, history tilted. The hunters had become the hunted. The arrogance of the Luftwaffe, forged in years of dominance, gave way to disbelief and dread. The despair of American pilots, carved by failure after failure, gave way to determination. Something small, almost laughably simple, had overturned years of doctrine. The sky, which once belonged to those who could escape, now belonged to those who could pursue. And yet, even in triumph, there was a strange quietness, a sense of awe at what had been accomplished. The Lightning, once mocked for its fatal flaw, now carried within it the spirit of redemption. The engineers who had labored in obscurity, the test pilots who had risked everything, the men who believed when others doubted, all their efforts had culminated in this moment. The war was far from over, but the rules of engagement had changed forever. It is a lesson that resonates even beyond the battlefield. In the crucible of war, victory does not always come from grand inventions or overwhelming force. Sometimes it comes from a detail so small it is almost invisible, from a change so subtle it seems insignificant, until it alters the fate of nations. The dive recovery flaps were not glamorous, not majestic, but they were decisive. And in their quiet power lay the truth that history often turns not on miracles, but on the courage to believe in the simplest of solutions. So the question that had haunted pilots and engineers alike was answered not in the safety of tests, but in the fire of combat. Yes, something so small could overturn 3 years of certainty. Yes, a pair of aluminum plates could strip away the enemy's last defense. Yes, the course of the air war could be changed, not by a revolution, but by an innovation so humble it seemed almost invisible. And as the Lightning followed its prey through dives that once spelled death, the world bore witness to the transformation. The sky itself had shifted, and nothing in the war would ever be the same again. The revelation had come like a crack of thunder, sudden and undeniable. For 3 long years, the dive had been Germany's covenant with survival, a tactic so certain that Luftwaffe pilots spoke of it as though it were a law of nature. But now, the law had been broken. The P-38 Lightning had followed them into the abyss, and worse, it had returned. The hunters, who once laughed as they rolled and plunged, now found their laughter silenced by the rattle of American guns, still at their heels. It was not just a technical shift. It was a rewriting of belief itself. In the quiet aftermath of those first encounters, word spread through squadrons like wildfire. Stories moved faster than orders, faster than official reports. A German A-stove sure of his escape and was cut down in flames when the Lightning refused to release him. Another pilot rolled confident in the ritual that had saved him countless times, only to find the American shadow fixed on his tail. For the men who heard these tales, certainty turned to unease. If the dive was no longer safe, then where could safety be found? It was a question whispered in ready rooms, muttered in hangars, unspoken but heavy in every cockpit. The Americans, too, felt the shift, though it was quieter, steadier, like a weight lifted from their shoulders. For years they had carried doubt, the heavy burden of a flaw they could not fight. Each mission began with the knowledge that their quarry could escape at will. Now at last, that burden eased. The Lightning pilots felt the difference not only in the stick that answered their touch, but in the courage that surged back into their hearts. They pressed their attacks harder, flew with renewed confidence, and discovered again the fire that had been dimmed by years of frustration. And yet history is not made by one skirmish, or even by one innovation alone. The dive recovery flaps were a key, but what they unlocked was larger than any single battle. They opened the door to a new chapter of the war in the air, a chapter in which belief and psychology weighed as heavily as machines and weapons. The Germans, robbed of their escape, were forced into turning fights where the concentrated firepower of the P-38 proved merciless. The Americans, emboldened, began to see the Luftwaffe not as untouchable hunters, but as prey that could finally be cornered. But war is never simple. For every success, there was still loss. For every lightning that pulled out of a dive, there was another that never returned. The flaps were a triumph, but they did not erase the dangers of the sky. Compressibility still lurked, waiting to punish the careless. Engines still failed. Guns still jammed. Flak still tore through aluminum and flesh. The war remained cruel, but now at least it was fairer, no longer tilted by a single fatal weakness. As summer turned to autumn in 1944, the transformation became unmistakable. Statistics shifted, kill ratios improved, the once reliable German escape rate collapsed. The Allies were tightening their grip on the skies, and with each passing week, the Luftwaffe bled more heavily, unable to replace the men they lost. The dive, once their salvation, had become their downfall. It was a cruel irony, but war is rich with such ironies. And in that irony lies the true power of the story. The dive recovery flaps were small, unglamorous, almost invisible, yet they carried within them the weight of destiny. They proved that in war, as in life, greatness often rests not on grand designs but on simple, decisive acts. A pair of aluminum plates conceived in desperation, forged in secrecy, and tested by courage, reshaped the fate of battles and the course of the war. Now, the stage was set for what came next. The Luftwaffe could no longer rely on its old doctrine. The Americans had found their footing and their fire. The skies above Europe were changing, and with them, the destiny of nations. What remained was the story of how this small innovation, born in workshops far from the front lines, rippled outward, until it touched every squadron, every mission, every life. This is where the tale turns from the intimacy of invention to the vast theater of combat. It is where the whispers of hope among engineers became the roar of victory among pilots. It is where belief, once shattered, was restored. The dive recovery flaps were no longer just a technical fix. They were a symbol proof that weakness could be turned into strength, that despair could give way to triumph, that even in the darkest hours of war, the smallest of changes could alter the fate of empires. And so we move forward into the heart of the story, into the skies where P-38 seconds met Messerschmitts in duels that shook the very air, into the missions where confidence returned to the eyes of American pilots and dread began to gnaw at the hearts of their foes, into the crucible where innovation met courage and together they forged the path to victory. The opening act has ended. The stage is set. The war in the air will never be the same. The story of the P-38 Lightning's dive recovery flaps is not just about a clever piece of engineering. It is about the way war magnifies both weakness and strength, how a single flaw can shake the confidence of an army, and how a single solution, humble, small, almost invisible, can restore hope and tilt the balance of power. For 3 long years, the Luftwaffe trusted gravity to save them, diving away with certainty while American pilots watched helplessly. Then came the flap's 2 slivers of aluminum that bent the laws of the sky back into Allied favor. What had once been sanctuary became a trap, and the hunters became the hunted. Looking back, it is almost poetic. The fate of battles, even of nations, often turns not on massive weapons or grand strategies, but on the courage to fix a flaw, to believe in a detail, to keep fighting when others scoff. The Lightning story reminds us that history is full of such turning points, moments when the impossible became possible because someone dared to try. It is a reminder that every innovation carries a human cost and a human triumph. The engineers who sketched late into the night, the test pilots who risked their lives, the combat pilots who trusted their machines and changed the war. And yet, this is only one thread in the vast tapestry of World War II. There are countless others, some forgotten, some still waiting to be told, each filled with its own blend of tragedy, ingenuity, and resilience. The story of the dive recovery flaps is not an end. It is an invitation to look deeper into the hidden corners of history, where the smallest of changes brought about the greatest of consequences. So now I turn to you. What do you think when you hear how a simple flap of metal rewrote the rules of air combat? Does it surprise you that wars are shaped not only by battles and generals, but by the quiet work of engineers and the daring of pilots? Share your thoughts below. I want to hear what moments in history you find most fascinating. And if this story has sparked your curiosity, then stay with us, because there are many more tales like this, stories of forgotten inventions, hidden dramas, and turning points that decided the fate of millions. History is not dusty pages in a book. It is alive, full of suspense and discovery, waiting to be retold. If you want to journey further into these hidden stories, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this with someone who loves history as much as you do. Together, we can keep these moments alive, so that the courage, the mistakes, and the triumphs of the past continue to speak to us today. And who knows? The next chapter we uncover might just change the way you see the war and perhaps even the world.